Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the delightful depths of medical absurdity, the horrifying treatments for nervous women in the 1800s. No, we're not talking about yoga retreats or herbal teas, I mean the real stuff. Think bloodletting, insane asylums, and the good old-fashioned lobotomy. Because what could be more soothing than drilling into someone's skull, right? So before you get comfortable with your cup of chamomile, take a second to like this video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments what era you'd fear most when it comes to dubious medical practices. Now, dim those lights, turn on a fan for that soothing white noise, and snuggle up like you're preparing for a long winter's nap. Except this nap involves leeches, questionable tonics, and a lot of societal judgment. Let's pause for a moment. Have you ever wondered what treatments were considered cutting edge back then? Did women really believe that they could be cured of anxiety with a good shouting match? What about the infamous rest cure? Did anyone actually think spending weeks in bed while being spoon-fed gruel would solve their problems? And just how many doctors had a thing for opiates? Well, congratulations. You've just woken up in the 1800s, and you're a nervous woman in need of attention, and not the good kind. Hold on tight. In the 1800s, if you were a nervous woman, chances were high that your biggest enemy was a very questionable diagnosis. Forget valid concerns. Doctors would hastily toss around terms like hysteria as if they were throwing confetti at a parade. This term originated from the Greek word for uterus because, of course, everything must be attributed to that convenient organ. You'd think getting a proper assessment would be simple, but no. Instead, you'd be subjected to a flurry of condescending smiles and a lot of finger-wagging about your perceived feminine frailty. And if that didn't make you feel like a wilted flower, the treatments that followed surely would. Picture this. You sit in a doctor's office, and by doctor, I mean some guy who spent more time reading textbooks than understanding that women are not simply a collection of emotions barely hanging on by a string. Deep concentration plastered on his face. He ponders your concerns while likely avoiding eye contact. Why? Because how dare a woman express anything less than joy during a conversation? As the doctor launches into a third-hand diatribe about how the world would have been better without women worrying, you can hear your mind slowly brewing a witty comeback. If only society allowed it. Instead of validating your feelings, these medical professionals often diagnosed every anxious sigh or nervous flutter with hysteria. Was it too much to ask for some compassion? If you happen to be a little overly dramatic, say, tossing your hands in the air when your dog ran away, well, that was practically a one-way ticket to the local asylum. Hysteria was the catch-all that captured women's frustrations and served them right back on a platter of humiliation. Then came the recommended treatments, which were like a grab bag of misguided, sometimes downright bizarre remedies. Your doctor might suggest a regimen that had you praying for relief while suffering through strict diets of bland foods and stomach-churning tonics. Why not just pour battery acid down your throat, you might wonder, as you down a concoction that tastes like regret and rotten cabbage. Let's not forget the glorious and radical notion of rest, touted as the ultimate cure-all. However, rest in the 1800s didn't mean curling up with your favourite book and a cup of tea. It meant being confined to bed, away from any stimulating pursuits like avoiding staring at the wall for hours on end and contemplating the weight of the universe, or worse, contemplating how long until someone checks in on you. Doctors believed inactivity would restore your nervous system, but little did they understand it had a far more adverse effect: introspection. Every tick and tock of the clock became a reminder of a world outside, of life happening without you. You might find yourself lounging in a plush yet frumpy gown, while being force-fed a steady diet of molasses-infused porridge. Yum! you'd gain weight, lose your mind, and reckon with the overly cheerful nurse on duty, who undoubtedly could win an award for annoying platitudes. Just think of happy things she chimes with the zest of a squirrel on caffeine as you try to negotiate your way out of your cloudy mental state, which has only gotten more tangled in all those chemical concoctions prescribed to you. What's worse, the lingering judgment of those who believe that please bring back sanity, you know how crazy I am era. Once stigmatized as hysterical, you could be shuffled off to the nice institution down the way where the nurses wear floor-length gowns that give off an air of "we mean business." Did they mean it though? Naturally, patients who checked in primarily left by two avenues, recovery or a coffin, and heaven forbid you dare speak your mind. Being too passionate about something might earn you a ticket to an asylum with a lovely view of the manicured grounds, perfect for musing over the meaning of life while listening to the background noise of someone else's treatment plan gone wrong. Alas, in all this turmoil, one good thing emerged: the realization that the legitimacy of women's feelings and experiences would eventually predominate. With time, voices began to cry out against the draconian methods of the 1800s, so call it a slow march toward progression, or a collective eye roll. But with each passing decade, women began reclaiming their narratives, not as emotional wrecks, but as resilient survivors. As we reflect on this tragicomic chapter of history, it's crucial to recognise that the conversation around mental health has since enjoyed a renaissance, highlighting how far we've come from those dark, judgmental corridors of the past. And indeed, women like you have moved mountains, faced absurdity head-on, and transformed every ounce of their struggles into fuel for advocacy and empowerment. The leech, a healthcare staple that would make any modern person's skin crawl. If you were deemed nervous, nothing quite said relax like having these slimy little creatures. Yes, suck your blood. Healthcare practitioners of the time believed that leeches could either drain bad blood or rejuvenate your system depending on their mood, or the chart they were reading. Imagine lying on a couch with dozens of these little vampires while trying not to contemplate your life choices. First, let's set the scene. Picture a dimly lit room filled with strange medical paraphernalia, bone saws, jars of pickled organs, and various herbs you can't quite identify. And in the corner, there's the leech bowl glistening ominously. You might be longing to escape and wondering if you'd have been better off just staying home and binge-watching your favourite dramas on the telly. Each plump leech is like a tiny, bumpy, bloodthirsty contortionist that wriggles its way toward your skin, ready to chomp down and begin its delicious feast. You might hesitate and think, is this really necessary? But your doctor, standing there with a perfectly manicured moustache and an air of misplaced confidence, assures you this is indeed the latest in medical science. So here you lie, the unwitting star of your very own horror comedy show, played out on an inconceivably uncomfortable couch. The very thought of those little creatures attached to you might make you squirm more than any self-help book ever could. Yet this was considered a therapeutic endeavour. The centuries-old belief in humoral theory stipulated that one could be cured of various ailments, be it nerves, anxiety, or an overabundance of emotions, by balancing the body's four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Imagine if they had a company slogan: leeches, helping you drain your issues. How uplifting. As the leeches work their magic, or, just munched away, one could indulge in a relaxing soundtrack, the lovely squelch of creatures doing their thing, punctuated by your inexplicable collection of deep sighs. Oh, and don't forget the occasional "do you feel faint yet?" from the medical professional, who was inexplicably still enthralled by what was happening. The experience was less a healthcare remedy, and more a gateway to a Pandora's box of existential dread. and if you managed to endure a session without passing out from sheer panic, your doctor would declare you fit as a fiddle, assuming you survived the ordeal with a leech hangover, that is. Your skin might be mottled with the imprints of where they just suckled away your sap like they were out for a midnight snack. It was so common that there was a phrase, chemically reduced, to describe how you'd feel after shedding blood. Because nothing screams, "I'm ready to tackle the day," quite like having your life force borrowed. If bloodletting via leeches wasn't your thing, fear not. There were other delightful alternatives. Doctors were always brimming with creative remedies to ensure the nervous women of their time were unquestioningly relaxed. Some prescribed steaming hot herbal concoctions that left you sweating and wondering if you might spontaneously combust from the inside out. Or better yet, let's not forget the fascination with purging, because nothing reassures a woman burdened by societal expectations like being forcibly emptied out with a good old-fashioned emetic. In 19th century America there was a phenomenon called drunken medicine, a delightful mishmash of opiates, alcohol and various heady brews meant to dull the senses, also known as take the edge off. But surely who needs practical solutions when you could just have a small cocktail of toxins washing through your bloodstream? Cue the vintage party happening in your veins soundtrack. Through it all, women still found ways to bond over these absurd medical treatments. Together they would commiserate, sharing tender tears and laughter amidst the absurdity of it all. "Oh, Jane, do you think they'll have a leech-free option next time?" It was a sisterhood forged amidst the bizarre medical practices, a shared understanding that if you had to be subjected to ludicrous treatments, you might as well be cheeky about it. With leeches swirling in and out of ladies' lives, they were often left feeling more like characters out of a bizarre gothic novel than simply exhausted women. Wanting nothing more than to exist without invading creatures sucking life away, they faced a societal paradox, a quest for wellness alongside sheer madness. Being nervous was perhaps the most auspicious experience if the charming alternative involved a body count. So, there you go. Nothing quite like a drop of levity in the face of overwhelming lethargy and leeches, don't you think? If you think insomnia is terrible now, just wait till you hear about the rest cure. This treatment involved being confined to bed for weeks on end, where you'd be force-fed bland food and kept away from every form of stimulation, like reading, talking, or thinking about anything interesting. It's as if the doctors believe that boredom could cure anxiety. Congratulations! You could now experience every minute drop of your sanity, all from the comfort of a lace-fringed pillow. Picture this. You wake up in a room draped in pastels, where sunlight filters through lace curtains that are definitely older than your great-aunt Mildred. Your bed, the focal point of all your woes, is a fortress of pillows that looks cosy but feels like a remorseful prison. Rest is strongly encouraged, but what on earth does that mean when staring at the ceiling starts to feel like an Olympic sport? Boredom is licking its lips like a hungry feral cat, waiting for the slightest pang of interest to sneak through. You find yourself drifting into the deepest of thoughts. Thoughts of everything from your lunch plan to picking unyielding weeds in your garden, which, of course, are suddenly more interesting than your current situation. All while a kindly nurse, possibly trained during the last famine, brings you pale broth and an air of dispassionate sympathy. Healthcare experts during this time believed that mental fatigue could be cured by forcing patients into the most mind-numbing experience imaginable. It's like a chilling episode of Groundhog Day, except every day is the same and involves no chocolate for comfort. Imagine being told that your anxiety could vanish if you just twiddled your thumbs without saying a word, while the world went about its business outside your window. Meanwhile, your neighbours probably have a garden party complete with cakes, games and enough laughter to rival a Shakespearean comedy. All the while you're stuck staring at walls, contemplating how many times you can count the pink floral patterns on your wallpaper, and let's not ignore the food. Gone are the magically delicious brunches of avocado toast and artisanal coffee. Instead, you're presented with a plate of plain rice or mushy vegetable puree, designed with the sole purpose of leaving your taste buds yearning for rebellion. Yes, tasteless meals designed to soothe not just your stomach, but your very soul, or as close as they could get to that without serving up anything like salt or spices. Imagine trying to rally an appetite for a schedule that consists of 3 square timidity rations a day, prepared by someone who has obviously submitted their culinary skills to a higher authority. With this rest cure, they believed they could pacify your nerves just by keeping you from thinking. But you know what they say about idle minds. Boredom breeds shadows of anxiety that loom over you like an overzealous mother-in-law ready to tell you what you're doing wrong in life, and suddenly you find yourself unravelling. Your brain begins inventing stories about the nondescript chair in the corner of your room, its potential as a makeshift escape plan, or possibly an ancient relic of a period where common sense still prevailed. And then there was the company. The only ones allowed into your realm of solitude were individuals who eyed you with pity and thin veneer of compassion, dispensing medical advice that felt more like unsolicited commentary. You should simply rest more. Oh, thanks. Why didn't I think of that while shackled to this bed? You'd roll your eyes, but alas, eye-rolling requires energy, and energy is exactly what you're trying to conserve. Eventually, the cure would come to a traumatic shudder as your doctor, the one with the cologne that stings your senses more than fresh air ever could, deems you ready to rejoin society. But in the process of trying to wrest your way into sanity, you've somehow wound up more anxious than before. You slide into social situations feeling like a deer caught in the headlights, much more terrified of the vastness of reality than you ever anticipated. So, what does this miserable rest cure tell us? Well, it reflects the struggles women faced, stuck in a loop of judgment, poise, and the erratic expectations society imposed. It's an irony wrapped in comforters, like taking a bubble bath while you're set on fire. It may seem inviting at first, but the reality is hardly restorative. Thus, the rest cure shines a light on how absurd that misconception that confinement can save lives was. It was meant to be healing, but the question remains, did it help anyone really? Perhaps more than a few of these patients got quite the grasp on irony, feeling more like prisoners than patients, battling boredom while listeners around them perpetuated that confidence was a normative expectation. And so, with one foot in the world of high hopes and another in a bed of blandness, the resilience of these women emerged largely unfazed, ready to chart their own definitions of healing in the shadows of a world that sought to silence them. Who needs therapy when you have opium? The 1800s saw the drug-fueled goodness of opiates prescribed to help those nervous ladies chill out, which sounds great until you factor in that chilling out could also mean complete dependence and a host of problems, because nothing says outstanding care quite like treating anxiety with a high chance of becoming an addict. Yes, during this peculiar era, the medical community had a fondness for narcotics that bordered on enthusiastic, and opium was their drug of choice. The idea was simple. The more you blissed out, the less you felt your anxiety. Brilliant, right? Just a pinch of soot-like opium paste, and suddenly you're transformed from a screaming banshee into a serene goddess sipping tea. Let's take a moment to picture it. You're a woman in the 1800s, overwhelmed by the societal demands to conform, stay quiet and keep up appearances. Talk about pressure! When confronted with bouts of anxiety or what society deemed a little too much spirit, doctors leaned heavily on this magical elixir to calm those frayed nerves, opiates became the fashionable prescription of choice. Flush with optimism, physicians would hand out tiny bottles filled with thick, syrupy opium concoctions, confidently labelled as restoratives or soothe to sleep, as if they were marketing the latest trendy wellness smoothie. But here's the kicker. Nobody decided to disclose the not-so-sweet side effects. Dependence? Addiction? Pfft. Those were just buzzwords misunderstood by ungrateful patients. Honestly, who wouldn't want to drift off in a lovely haze of euphoria while ignoring all that pesky anxiety? You could imagine women fainting and being spirited away from society, only to awaken in their opium-induced dreams, euphoria at its finest, wrapped in soft pillows and scented like flowers, which incidentally is a metaphor for the rudimentary understanding of physical and mental health at that time. As opium use became more popular, a real pattern emerged. A countless number of anxious women began to rely more on these substances to function in their daily lives. Why fret over giving a rousing speech about household duties when you can just pop a few opium lozenges and saunter through it all like a graceful swan, said no one ever. Yet that's exactly how the sentiment seemed to flow through the cultural mindset of the era. Instead of empowering women to express their emotions, this reliance transformed them into blank slates, swaying somewhere between serene calm and utter confusion, all while society applauded their quietude. But before you get comfy thinking this was a happy little solution, let's not sugarcoat it. Women who indulged in the opiate life all too often found themselves tangled in a web of withdrawal and societal disapproval. As addiction crept in like an unwelcome ghost at a dinner party, issues of social shame arose, leading to further isolation. Being placed in asylums or clinics for treatments became not only commonplace but completely acceptable, because heaven forbid your neighbours saw you suffering from your nervous tendencies, fueled in large part by the substances the same society had prescribed. Still, some women said enough was enough. History tells us of the pioneers who rebelled against the status quo, knocking on the doors of their freedoms, advocating for alternative treatments. They began to question the moral compass of a culture that shunned genuine emotional expression in favour of pacification through opiates. Little by little, a movement towards understanding mental health began to emerge like an ill-fated plant, struggling to blossom in the shade. It was during this time that some began to advocate for changes, perhaps herbal remedies, more open discussions about anxiety, or even just a simple cup of tea served with a heartfelt ear to listen. Imagine that. Instead of offering someone a dose of syrupy opiate bliss, they encouraged community, compassion, and a soothing support network. That, dear listeners, might have been the only doctors women in this era really needed. In retrospect, the early normalization of opiate use serves as an absurd reminder of the lengths people would go to suppress emotions and maintain social order. It was as if society was saying, "Ladies, we love your ability to be quiet, but heaven forbid you actually express how you feel." So the next time you think about the story of women's struggles, remember, they faced more than just therapies gone awry. They lived through an era that used substances to solve problems with next to no foresight or understanding. One could question whether the term nervous lady was less about the symptoms displayed and more about the societal confines that forced women to retreat into opiate oblivion instead of embracing their voice. So, raise a glass, perhaps filled with a non-opiated tea, to those who soldiered on through the whimsical indifference of the 1800s, courageous women who ultimately triumphed over this wild whirlwind of medical mishaps, emerging with tales now part of our collective journey to better understanding and acceptance of mental health. Tired of dealing with a nervous woman? Just ship her off to an asylum. The 1800s were rich with these facilities, where women would often end up simply for being a bit outspoken, overly emotional, or just plain tired of the oppressive societal expectations placed on them. Think of it as an early form of self-care, except you had about as much independence as a caged parakeet with no chance of ever seeing the world outside. You see, asylums weren't exactly designed as charming retreats filled with sunshine and pastel-coloured walls adorned with kittens. Nope, they were like the world's worst vacation, where relaxation was replaced with an urgent need to escape an endless cycle of petticoat prison. Step inside an asylum and you'd be faced with a chilling tableau. Rows of weary women dressed in identical drab garments, their expressions ranging from vacant to outright despair. The ambience was akin to a really sad wedding reception, minus the cake and dancing, and with an overwhelming stench of despair and unwashed bodies. Picture it. You're calmly rocking in a chair, trying to reclaim your sanity, when someone nearby suddenly screams about the temperature of the soup, and you realise it was made with the last week's leftovers. You can almost hear the staff whispering to each other in muted tones about how their collective ineptitude could be causing the riotous discord around. The unfortunate truth is, the economic incentive for asylums has its roots in societal expectations. If a woman stepped even slightly out of line, showing too much emotion, questioning authority, or, God forbid, desiring a life beyond cooking and cleaning, she risked being carted off. Doctors had a particularly fond way of deciding who belonged in these institutions. If you complained, you were nervous. If you cried, you were hysteric. And if you fell asleep during a man's lecture, well, there went your membership into the Crazy Ladies Club. This club was less Lady Gaga and more drag you down disturbing. Nervous became a catch-all word that separated enthusiastic women with ambitions from those deemed unworthy of free will. Once you were in an asylum, the treatments were about as pleasant as a root canal without anaesthesia. Welcome to the regimen of cold baths, isolation rooms, and bizarre contraptions meant to reform your behaviour. Cold water baths were a staple, administered with the kind of casual brutality reminiscent of a medieval torture device. Imagine being shoved into a semi-freezing tub while staff murmured reassurances that you just needed to cool off. One would rather have a hot bath sprinkled with rose petals. But alas, joy was not part of the asylum experience. Instead, they ensured you'd never long for freedom again, with constant reminders of your place in this institution of care. The staff often included people who were more interested in their next coffee break than the well-being of their charges. The authority figures tended to see treatment less like a compassionate act and more like an opportunity to maintain a warped sense of order. "Excuse me, madame, but it seems your existential dread requires more than a stern talking to." Or perhaps they believed that a brisk lecture on good manners would somehow lift the fog of despair clouding your mind. Among the medical experiments deemed effective, there were also lovely devices like the tranquilizer chair, used to keep overly animated individuals locked down, and not in a good way. You would be strapped in like Frankenstein's monster. Surprise! It would reassure you of nothing more than your tight grip on sanity slipping away. Fancy that. It is delight to live among other women rendered merely as subjects of dubious psychological exploration. Yet for every story of despair, there were sides of resilience that emerged. Women found ways to carve out friendships, support one another, and unsanctioned giggles as well. It was as if they were creating a black market of relief, simply bonding over shared trials of isolation, misdiagnosis, and state-sponsored misery. They managed to turn the tables on institutional gloom, even for a brief, glorious moment, by whispering jokes in the dim corners of their cells. By the end of the century, with the rise of the suffragette movement and growing awareness of women's issues, asylum started to feel less like an economic solution and more like a prison. And though the asylums may have faded from view, the determination of those nervous women paved the way for future generations who dared to speak out. They did not just survive, they turned their experiences into knowledge and awareness, forcing society not just to see, but to reconsider what it meant to be a woman grappling with life's pressures. So while the 1800s had its fair share of horrors, it also brought with it glimmers of hope and resilience. You have to admire the spirit of the nervous women who, despite being treated like wandering sheep until they could be returned to their herd, managed to rise above the circumstances and in some ways change the narrative entirely. Because true sanity lies not just in the absence of emotion, but in the strength to rally against it and endure. What do you do when a woman is nervous? Why not shock her into submission? Electrotherapy treatments became all the rage for women deemed hysterical. Imagine being hooked up to a machine that might electrocute you back into calmness. After all, nothing like a little jolt to make you question your entire existence even more. Doctors of the time seemed to operate on the principle that if something sounds frightening, it must be effective. You'd find yourself strapped into a chair that looked suspiciously similar to an electric chair. Only there were no dramatic hissing sounds, just blinding flashes and jolts that made you wonder whether you were actually being healed or just being turned into a slightly less anxious Frankenstein. As the machine cranked up, the air would crackle with anticipation. Or was it static? You'd sit there nervously fighting the urge to giggle at the absurdly modernity of it all, while your doctor stood there with an expression that could only be described as medieval bliss. What came next was the hope of salvation. Lightning! That's right. In the 1800s, it was perfectly acceptable to fry your nerves in a potpourri of electricity and high hopes. When the first jolt hit you, it felt like an electric eel had just decided to take residence in your knickers. The device aimed to realign your humours, which is just a fancy way of saying, we have no actual clue what we're doing here, so let's play doctor with some gizmos. But here's the kicker. Not only did this therapy create the illusion of progress, but it also became a gathering ground for spectators. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, it turned into an early form of entertainment. Imagine your friends and family gathering around as you sweat and twitch in the chair, while doctors become enthusiastic cheerleaders for the whole debacle. Look, she's having a breakthrough, they'd shout, while thoughts of breakthrough were really only about whether or not you'd survive the session with your sanity intact. Glee! Who needs a circus when you can watch Aunt Gertrude spar with the gods of electricity? Now, let's not forget about the typewriter-like instruments that were all the rage at the time. These gadgets had wires, bells, and knobs in various contorted positions. The doctor would hold the magic wand with geometric precision, ready to zap you into tranquility. You might laugh, you might cry, and you might involuntarily kick the nurse, but we'll add uncontrollable movements to the list of potential symptoms labelled under a new diagnosis for women, pioneering frustration. But wait, you might be asking, did this actually work? Well, history holds many answers, and unfortunately, these were often just as shocking as the treatment itself. For some women, electrotherapy seemed to offer brief moments of relief, mostly because they were too stunned to remember their anxious thoughts. You know it's bad when you find solace in a brief electrifying shock rather than introspection. But these fleeting moments would eventually return, sparking a recurring cycle of relying on shocking revelations amidst continued psychiatric torment. Even the sessions themselves were quite the spectacle, often resembling something out of a science fiction novel gone terribly awry. Some doctors took things a step further by inviting their patients to wear fashionable conductive garments during the treatments. Imagine slipping into a metallic-lined dress, fine-tuning the fabric for maximum electrical contact with your skin. Your nervous laughter is corroborated by the realization that you've now merged haute couture with the absurdity of medical fashion. electrotherapy soon escalated into colourful discussions and theatrical protests. Much like the earliest versions of group therapy, these sessions drew in more curious participants than just your average nervous woman. Friends would bring along signs exclaiming, "Let's bank on the electric cure." Meanwhile, casual conversations revolved around which machine seemed to deliver the juiciest shocks. The ongoing debate was not unlike the latest gossip around town. As the years rolled on and science progressed, unfortunately, electrotherapy slowly began to dim like an overworked light bulb. Society eventually learned how dangerous, if not downright mad, it was to subject themselves to such thrilling tortures in the name of mental health. But for a moment it shone brightly, igniting a ripple of heated debate over what truly constitutes healing. You can only imagine what those women would say today. Probably something akin to, "Well, at least we're not zapping each other anymore." So whether you were a well-to-do lady or a working-class woman, electrotherapy remained an experience that felt like a lethal combination of wonder and anxiety. For every shock that beamed through your frazzled nerves, there was a simultaneous concern for your sanity, mixing horror with desirable progress very much like a 19th century cocktail. You couldn't turn back the clock now, could you? The next time you feel overwhelmed at work, or perhaps even when scrolling through social media, you can either sip a soothing tea or look back on this historical absurdity and thank your stars that you missed a jolt from an electrotherapy contraption. If you thought soaking in a hot tub was the height of relaxation, think again. Hydrotherapy involved being drenched, wrapped in wet sheets, or, worse yet, dipped into a freezing cold bath until your nerves calmed. It's like going to a spa but without the relaxation, and more the sensation of physically drowning in your anxieties instead. You see, many physicians of the time believed that water could wash away the nasties of a nervous disposition. The only problem, they seemed to think only in extremes. From scaldingly hot baths to ice-cold plunges, there was no middle ground, because why would anyone strive for comfort when they could achieve the fine art of torture? Now picture yourself, shivering, perhaps, stripped to your nightgown, standing before a large wooden tub, steam billowing around you like a scene from a horror film. But wait, there's more. Your physician, a man wearing overly dignified spectacles, probably with a handlebar moustache, enthusiastically instructs you to leap in. First, you get the scorching treatment, hot water that feels like lava, as it does a delightful job of searing your skin. At the very least, those nerves might take a back seat to the immediate concern of not being charred alive. But let's not discount the joys of being soaked in ice water, because being plunged into freezing depths had its own rejuvenating perks, like the breathtaking ability to numb your entire body as if you were prepping to face an Arctic blizzard. Many women felt that one quick dip would not only rid them of their anxieties, but also potentially set a new precedent for how to perform a modern-day penguin jump. Before long, you'd emerge either refreshed or on the verge of hypothermia, creating some great dinner-table conversations about your supposed miracle cure. Throughout the process, it was important to maintain what they called a calm disposition. Oh, sure, because nothing says relaxation like being wrapped in wet sheets or plunging into a frigid pool while you splash around like a fish out of water. In fact, during hydrotherapy sessions, known as water cures, the more hysterical a patient was, the more the practitioners doubled down on the chilly gestures of affection. The psychology was quite simple, really. The doctors often felt that the more discomfort they inflicted, the less anxiety a woman would feel afterward. Talk about a warped understanding of healing. After enduring these watery humiliations, you would be toiled in damp linen because nothing says daily self-care quite like stiff, uncomfortably wet sheets clinging to your skin like an awkward first date. You know what was missing from this experience? Anything remotely resembling comfort. The logic was that while you flailed in your drenched state, you might just forget the emotional distress that has driven you to such an odd treatment in the first place. You might ask yourself, what's more relaxing, enduring the chilling embrace of water or the suffocating grip of society's expectations? Naturally, there were other tactics employed in this world of hydropathy. The use of showers was a popular but amusing addition to the entire muddled exercise. You might think therapeutic showers involved gentle droplets cascading down your back like a rainstorm of tranquility. But no, these were high-pressure blasting showers designed to spray you within an inch of your life. If spa treatments today were anything like this, would anyone ever return? Those early hydrotherapy experiments turned women into human geysers as they emerge from their sessions, drenched and potentially more anxious than they started. Modern comparisons aside, the truth is that hydrotherapy was a strange patchwork of flawed science and haphazard experimentation. Women, often already trying to navigate the societal pressures of the day, were subjected to treatments that, instead of relaxing, seemed to complicate their already convoluted lives. But really, who could blame these earnest practitioners? They genuinely believed that by submerging women in water, be it scalding hot or icy cold, they were actually flushing out the maladies of the female mind. And in the great and fantastically absurd tradition of 1800s medical advice, each drop of water was, in their opinion, a step toward womanly sovereignty over her emotions. Today, we may look back and laugh, but for the women of that time, each experience was more than just a metaphorical or literal drenching. It was an ongoing struggle against both water and the deeply rooted misconceptions of their own worth and mental wellness. What better way to treat nerves than to just drain some blood? Bloodletting involved using leeches, scalpels, or, if the doctor was feeling particularly medieval, letting the patient bleed out into a bowl. The prevailing thought was that by reducing excess blood, you'd restore balance. Spoiler, most people ended up fainting in the process, but hey, at least they were in it together. Picture yourself in a dimly lit, musty office, where walls are lined with dusty jars of herbs that may or may not have been pilfered from the neighbour's garden. The doctor, looking regal in his frayed cloak, is rubbing his hands with glee at the prospect of a fresh victim. Patient. And there you are, in a chair that might very well be constructed from the remnants of a slaughtered cow. As the doctor readies a leech or the dull blade of his scalpel, you're left to contemplate the validity of his methods while inwardly cursing your entire lineage for making you a woman in this era. Wouldn't it be better to have a psychiatrist? But instead, you have a man convinced that pouring out your blood will clear the fog from your mind. Imagine lying back and watching as he flicks the leech into a bowl full of salt water. It competes with the jar labelled opium for nerves. Is this what medical advancements look like? You can't help but wonder how far modern medicine has come, only to realise that some things never change. Your heart races at the thought of being a trending topic at the next dinner party. Did you hear about the poor lady whose doctor decided she had too much excess blood? What a wild night. As the leech finds its new home on your arm, you can't help but chuckle at the sheer absurdity of it all. This is a creature that looks like it just crawled out of a nightmare, and here you are, inviting it to feast on you like it's the Last Supper. The sensation is, well, interesting. Not quite painful, but definitely unsettling. It's as if you've invited an unsolicited guest who refuses to leave, all the while nibbling away at your sanity, or in this case, your blood. What did they think would happen? Did they genuinely believe that a few ounces of blood loss would suddenly remove your anxiety? Or were they just in it for the drama? Oh, another lady has the vapours. Quick, bring the leeches. This one looks like she could use a good faint. The logic was baffling, considering that losing blood was hardly a foolproof treatment strategy. It's akin to taking your car to the mechanic because the engine light is on, and he decides to cut a hole in the hood and toss out a spark plug. Possible solutions were flowing from both wells, but the results tended to end with fainting couches being excessively utilised. And though you remain sceptical, part of you finds the entire ordeal amusing. Once again, the irony runs deep. A woman who's been labelled nervous for expressing her discontent with societal constraints is subjected to a practice that makes her feel worse than before. While you're lightheaded and wondering whether you might actually float away from this rendezvous with a bloodsucker, your mind drifts to others who've fallen prey to these odd treatments. Surely there's a support group for all of you bedridden ladies, nodding solemnly to each other over cups of tea while bemoaning the trials of bloodletting. As the leech continues to enjoy dinner, a disturbing thought crosses your mind. Maybe this is where they got the idea that women are too emotional and need pacifying. Give them an evening on the sofa with a self-help book and a cup of herbal tea instead. Or how about an unreasonably long shopping spree to take their minds off things? Who needs more blood when you can just buy cute blouses? But there's no miracle cure in sight. You're left to ponder whether you'd rather have your sanity intact or simply collapse at the thought of that dinner party. When all is said and done, bloodletting was merely a symptom of its time, historically hilarious, absurd, and a startling reminder that every generation has its radical approaches to mental health. So, while some things have improved, at least we can thank the stars we no longer have to venture into a doctor's office, arms ready for the next set of leeches, wondering who wanted to be the most excessively drained on a Thursday afternoon. With a few last flicks of the blade and the leeches properly disposed of, you leave the antiquated office, feeling slightly lighter and possibly only a little woozy. After all, who needs their blood when they can walk away with a whole new sense of self, minus a pint or two? Welcome to the charming world of 1800s medicine, where bloodletting was just one of the many prescriptions for a nervous life. And you, dear friend, were always in wonderful company. Way with cravings. Diets were handed out like candy in the 1800s, complete with mystifying recipes meant to soothe those hysteria symptoms. Think ashwater smoothies, or calming broths. Actual food forms made to induce boredom rather than comfort. Because, of course, proper nourishment was less about calories and more about making you miserable until you forgot what was upsetting you in the first place. It's the culinary equivalent of wearing a burlap sack and calling it high fashion. If you tried asking for a glass of water, the typical response would be more akin to, "Oh dear, let's see what's on today's low nutrition menu, and let's not even begin with the appealing culinary delights of the rest cure." The 19th century equivalent of binge-watching your least favourite shows on repeat. This regimen demanded confinement to bed, complete with trays of flavourless mush, because nothing says convalescence like a meal that requires no chewing and zero taste. Why not whip up a batch of tasteless oatmeal infused with blandness for maximum enjoyment? So, as you lay there in your satin pyjamas, the only treat you're allowed is perhaps a teaspoon of honey, because heaven forbid you should enjoy actual food while trying to recover your sanity. The menu would often feature combinations that could frighten any modern foodie. How about some overcooked cabbage leaves slathered in a mystery cream? Or perhaps a porridge anchored by the last of the week's bread, played up like it was a gourmet treat. Every morsel was chewed with a heavy heart, and a delicate palate more in tune with the flavour of despair than any actual culinary experience. Each bite reminded you of how far society's perception of nourishment had strayed from genuine hunger towards a sinister form of self-denial served in dainty ceramic dishes. While men feasted on hearty meat stews and rich desserts, thank you, gender norms, women were served concoctions that seemed less like tacos from the heavens and more like something you'd scrape off the bottom of an old shoe. These diets were presented as being good for the soul. Who knew starvation could also be a means to Mordor? Well, at least it would be for your taste buds. But it wasn't just about starvation. Oh no! Enter the world of home remedies, where every household possessed a secret recipe like some sort of demented scavenger hunt through the annals of culinary history. Why have a doctor prescribed medicine when you can drink an herbal tea brewed from dried tree bark and a pinch of crushed rock? Feel the healing powers of nature as you sip on this delightful concoction of despair. There's nothing like the taste of ambivalence to perk you right up. Women were even encouraged to maintain a strict regimen, often leaving them staggering through a haze of hunger and confusion. Grazing was not the norm. Rather, meals were to be structured around unyielding schedules that made a dentist appointment feel decidedly more appetizing. Each day became a battle for survival, and the kitchen transformed into a hazy battlefield, where the most dangerous weapon was a spoonful of dried herbs that tasted like despair, mixed with a sprinkle of shame. And then there were the notorious calming teas, those miracle brews filled with drops of serenity. You'd think it would do something wonderful, right? Wrong! It was like sipping liquid cardboard infused with a hint of regret. Perhaps you could pair that with a lovely bowl of boiled potato water, and you'd have yourself a makeshift 5-course meal that took getting by to new heights of culinary embarrassment. Women were basically signed on for a hefty dose of societal misunderstanding, masked in clay pots shaped like visions of relief, but filled with the dietetic equivalent of big, sad nothing. By the end of it all, one couldn't help but wonder if this elaborate web of dietary restrictions wasn't just a clever ruse. Perhaps the actual goal was to bore you into submission, to render you so listless that you would forget all about your personal desires and begin to entertain the real issues at hand, like why you had to eat like a squirrel whose foraging days were numbered. As you sat with your glass of tasteless sludge, you appreciated how society's medicine wanted you to embrace quiet desperation, because why not, right? In conclusion, these eccentric diets, framed as curative, turned out to be more about stifling voices than soothing nerves. So next time you sit to enjoy a perfectly crafted meal, maybe raise a glass of something delicious to those poor women of the 1800s who endured culinary treatments designed to smother their spirits, all in the name of sanity. Here's to forgetting the awful food while embracing the joy of flavour. Nothing screams mental wellness like confinement in the home. Women were often told to stay away from the outside world and focus on virtuous duties to keep their spirits high. You'd find yourself spending days knitting and cleaning, a particularly vibrant way to ensure you'd have time to contemplate every existential dread you ever had through sheer monotony. Picture this. You're sitting in a dark, cramped corner of your home. A cosy spot full of shadows, dust bunnies, and that suspicious smell of last week's cabbage. Your hands are busy working on a never-ending knitted masterpiece that began as a charming blanket and quickly morphed into an oversized ball of yarn that feels like it might consume you instead. Meanwhile, outside, life is bursting with vigour, riddled with colour and human interaction, while in here, the most scandalous happening is the paint on the wall peeling gently, like the last bit of your sanity. And let's not even talk about the list of virtuous duties you're expected to perform. From dawn until dusk, a slew of domestic responsibilities beckoned. Dusting, sweeping, laundry, each activity designed not just to keep the house clean, but to keep you confined within its four walls like a butterfly trapped in a glass jar. Forget self-care. Your worth was tied directly to how immaculate your home looked, and how many looms you managed to keep spinning. Of course, while you were busy being the embodiment of domesticity, a cavalcade of judgments arose. The constant chatter came from neighbours, family and your husband, who undoubtedly believed there was a special corner in the afterlife reserved for women who mastered the art of cleanliness. Thoughts like, well, she clearly doesn't keep a tidy home, maybe that's why she's always so anxious, would swirl around like a festering cloud, beautifully ripe with hypocrisy. The irony? Your anxiety was doubted, minimised, or entirely blamed on how effectively you can wield a feather duster. Already simmering like a pot that's about to boil over, your mind often drifts to daydreams of distant lands far beyond the edges of your four walls. Some enchanting place where women donned capes and fought dragons instead of scrubbing floors. Imagine feeling free to roam without the incessant worry of hourglass figures where your worth is measured by the number of stitches in your embroidery. Would that life come with captivating adventures? Would they praise your bravery or your ability to make perfect simmered stew while dodging judgmental glares? Spoiler alert, in your current state, the only dragons you're battling are imaginary, and they tend to fly away when someone else decides to take control of your woes. Oh, but then comes the saviour of your home life, hobbies. You might think stepping away from mundane chores would lead to a vibrant pursuit of interests, like painting or playing the piano. If you were lucky enough to carve out any time for personal joy that didn't involve household tasks, you'd inevitably be reminded that any hobby should ideally benefit the family. So forget dueling with a paintbrush. You're more likely to forge ahead and create a beautiful rug to please your husband's aesthetic sensibilities. And don't dare misunderstand. The idea that women's mental wellness could somehow be restored through complete seclusion was thought pure and unproblematic. After all, a woman's place meant her sole purpose rested within the home, and stepping beyond those confines could lead to unwanted attention or, gasp, social judgment. The paranoia of virtue being tarnished sent many women spiralling into a constant state of discomfort, an emotional prison crafted to look quaint and charming from the outside. Imagine life inside these virtuous homes, a cacophony of sock knitting while silently contemplating world events. The absurdities of life somehow distant yet painfully close. Perhaps if the world outside weren't so tempting, the true marvel of being a hermit would shine a little brighter. But just as every shade has its own tale, every house held untold stories of women yearning to shatter the silent facade and escape to unknown horizons. So here you are, on this self-imposed isolation adventure, where the only dragons you've got are the ones you keep in your mind, twisting and twining themselves into fearsome beastly anxieties that lurk in the shadows. It turns out living in this virtuous haven was more akin to navigating a labyrinth where every twist led deeper into submission, not liberation. Through sheer repetition, you become the protagonist of your muted narrative, the tale of a woman seeking an escape while playing house with the restless echoes of your desires. The joys of society's noble ideals, where outside adventures dance tantalizingly on the horizon, yet the only quest you could undertake was the not-so-thrilling scavenger hunt for dust bunnies and stray thoughts. Who knew the path to wellness and clarity would turn into a labyrinth of weaving and washing, one elegantly self-contained in the absurdity of domesticity? And all of this, curiously enough, is but one chapter in the wild saga of being a nervous woman in the 1800s. What was more crippling than being nervous? The overwhelming pressure of public opinion. Women were often shamed, silenced, and ultimately ostracized for displaying any hint of mental distress. Imagine trying to be discreet about your panic, while simultaneously worrying that your nosy neighbour might catch wind of your distressing state, and voila. Your quest for a peace becomes the local headline. The 1800s had no shortage of scandalized whispers and judgmental glances. Mental health wasn't just personal, it was public entertainment. Picture yourself as a nervous woman in this society. You wake up with a sense of dread, trying to rationalise it in a world where emotions are often treated like dirty laundry best kept hidden. Instead of simply dealing with your anxiety in peace, you have to navigate an elaborate minefield of societal expectations. You could be seen clutching your chest, breathing heavily, or, heavens above, actually crying in a social setting. The mere sight might send your acquaintances into a frenzy. Did you see her? The hysteria is oozing out of her. She should be locked up. It's like living in an ongoing episode of a grim reality show where you're the tragic main character. And don't even get me started on the letters that would be sent around town. The tidbits of gossip often travelled faster than you could say nervous breakdown. Your own family could become your worst enemies, offering unsolicited advice that varied from perhaps a good walk in the garden would do her good, to the more morbid suggestions of heading straight to the asylum. Because why should your mental state only concern you when it can provide juicy gossip for the entire village? It's a classic conundrum. You may find yourself cultivating a delightful double life. By day, you're a charming lady of societal duty. Candlelit gatherings, teacups, and polite conversation, a performance worthy of the stage. But by night, when the lights dim and the ghosts of judgment fade, you'd be left alone with your anxious thoughts, struggling between your facade and the chaos brewing within. Ever try to enjoy a midnight cup of tea when your mind is trying to shout you into a state of panic? Spoiler, it doesn't go well. This public image panic could become a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's easy to spiral into a state of acute anxiety when every twitch of your eye is scrutinised. Tension mounts at church services where your anxious demeanour could doom you to become the parish's most talked about subject, where one sneeze can lead to speculation of tuberculosis. So there you are, trying to fit in with woven basket charm, but secretly counting your breaths like they're precious commodities. Society had some interesting ideas about what made for a proper woman too. If you started to show signs of being less than perfectly composed, you risk burning the very social fabric that held your status together. When your friends talked about a lovely dinner party, were they prepared for an uncomfortable excursion through your vulnerability? Or worse, would they start treading on the thin ice of concern? Oh dear, it seems she's lost herself to the vapours. As time wore on, women began to notice a common trend in these antics. They were often treated less like individuals with mental health needs and more like characters in a theatre production, needing to rehearse their emotions on stage for public consumption. Pretty wild, right? Forget about forging a path to healing. You've just signed up for a dramatic interpretation of your life journey, where public opinion holds up the critic's scorecard. While some women refuse to conform, embracing their mental states, others succumb to the overwhelming tide of societal expectations. They learn to laugh nervously, dress the part of the role society assigned them, and mask their true feelings with delicate smiles while repressing their personal struggles. It became a skill set to project stoicism despite feeling like a tightly wound spring inside. So here's the question. How do you balance societal pressures with the need for self-acceptance? The answer eluded many, but one thing's for sure, these women persevered and adapted, creating hidden allegiances as they whispered about their true experiences over teacups late into the night, finding companionship in the very chaos that sought to isolate them. The great paradox was that it was in those shared moments of vulnerability where genuine healing began. The laughter, the tears, and the unfiltered reality that reminded them they were not alone. Public image panic may have dictated societal norms, but the heart of the nervous woman continued to beat with a rhythm not easily silenced, echoing the resistance to a world that often sought to define her existence with fear and judgment. And in that space, they carved out their own narratives. those nervous women often found themselves transformed into subjects of medical charity, but with a heavy dose of condescension. Viewing you as a charity case might seem sweet until you realise charitable organisations meant volunteering their expert opinions on your mental well-being while disregarding your ability to exist without someone helping you. Imagine, if you will, a sleek parlour with a high ceiling, ornate wallpaper stunning enough to distract you from your anxiety. Perfect. You find yourself in a room full of women, all labelled as needy, dressed in the fashion of the time, holding frilly handkerchiefs as if they were shields against the world and every man's patronising gaze. You know, the kind of philanthropy where sympathy drips from the walls like melting candle wax. Your diagnosis comes with a side of tea, and an unsolicited lecture from a gentleman with a moustache so grand it could easily double as a broom. He's fond of casually tossing around platitudes about feminine delicacy and your poor nerves. You can't help but wonder what he's basing this on. Your complexion, the lace on your collar, or perhaps the quiet manner in which you're attempting to breathe through the realization that you're being discussed like some sort of museum artifact. As you sip your herbal infusion, which you suspect is made from exotic leaves, you listen to anecdotes from other women about their nervous conditions. Some relate tales of being faint or dazed in crowded spaces, common themes of the day. You realize, in horror, that even the act of spilling your tea might be perceived as a direct consequence of your hysteria. You're led to believe that with enough sympathetic nods, you'll emerge from this charity care with a shiny medal economy on your bravery in facing your predicament. Is it just you, or does this charity approach feel like an elaborate scheme to shackle you to their woes? To truly understand this curious predicament, let's talk about the societal vacuum at play. In quaint gatherings across parlours and porches, well-meaning society ladies would often conspire about the nervous woman plight, as though they were discussing the latest fashions. In their minds, your nerves appeared to be a spectacular romanticism of sorts, a tragic muse for their benevolence. They concocted charities not merely to provide assistance, but to solidify their image as virtuous caretakers. Your discomfort became a trophy for their self-image, while they sipped tea as if to toast their own perceived nobility. As care poured in from all sides, you quickly realised that much of it missed the mark entirely. You might receive invitations to well-meaning retreats under the guise of charity, which essentially involved long silences and equally stifling herb-infused waters. It was the perfect recipe for a nervous breakdown, but more than that, it was clear that the intention was not about your comfort, but about giving those with benevolent aspirations a warm glow that followed their good deeds. A bit like what one might feel after planting a flower, yet, rather than flourishing, you felt more like a withering daisy, subject to vagaries in weather and manicured gardens. But all this frivolity came with its own set of paradoxes. The charity events often turned into social spectacles, where one's neuroses suddenly became the talk of the town, not in whispered corridors, but loud banquets where everyone pretended to care. Citizens would show up, sip punch, and nod along, acting as if the entire affair were the height of altruism, while secretly revelling in your misfortunes as their very own entertainment. Who knew that being unwell could turn you into the centre of attention? Of course, the so-called experts attached to these charities were rarely trained in any actual medicine. More often than not, they had checked off the right boxes of gender, class and lifestyle during their rise through college, graduating only in the art of piety, as if degrees in kindness and idle chatter had suddenly become legitimate forms of therapy. You might find yourself under the watchful gaze of a well-fed godsent who believed that deep breathing and positive affirmations, delivered in a flowery brochure, were the ultimate cures for an emotional malaise. "Just relax, dear," they'd coo. while you're internally contemplating the glares of judgment thrown your way at every whim. As the charity extended its helping hand, you realised with a mixture of frustration and dark humour that your very existence had become a banquet for the self-appointed noblewomen of society. Their attempts to soothe became a litany of loony revelations, ones you would likely recount over gregarious giggles with your friends during afternoon tea, if only they understood. And yet, you can't help but consider the irony. You are stuck in a web woven from the very threads that claim to help, creating an intricate tapestry of expectation, paternalism, and absolute bafflement. So, dear listener, the tale of medical charity for nervous women in the 1800s is nothing but a fine balance of sympathy turned spectacle. Yes, here you were, tasked to navigate through a maze of well-intentioned foolishness, surrounded by fancy dresses, pleasantries delivered through clenched teeth, and the unyielding awareness that your nervous condition was, in their eyes, possibly the most fashionable of statements. A very tangled, very charming, and altogether absurd road to recovery, one best travelled with a good dose of irony, and perhaps a smirking tea-infused chuckle. What if your nerves became a statement on how you dressed? Women experiencing anxiety were often expected to embody an aesthetic of fragility, draped in wispy fabrics and flowing materials that managed to scream both elegance and approach with caution. All the while, they were left wondering if clothing could combat the onslaught of societal expectations that had them feeling like glass. You'd walk down the street in sheer silks that rustled softly with every nervous step, making you feel as if every head turned to assess your delicate state. It's like trying to look calm while walking on a tightrope over an alligator pit. One wrong move, and suddenly you're not just underdressed. You're a complete disaster, teetering on the edge of societal collapse. The fashion of the 1800s was not just about style, it was a metaphor for the societal pressures felt by women. Each puffed sleeve and corseted waist whispered the message, "Be beautiful, but don't breathe too deeply." You'd train your posture to be as stiff and perfectly aligned as your corset allowed, while attempting to find your zen amid a cocktail of anxiety and the overwhelming weight of fabric. These constraining outfits were designed to accentuate delicate femininity, putting you in a veritable vice of societal expectations. As if that weren't enough, even your accessories were a calculated risk, a brooch to signal wealth and status, or perhaps a fan to shield your face as you feigned tranquility while secretly sweating about losing your spot at the social tea party. And let's talk about the colours. Soft pastels ruled this fashion realm. Whispers of lavender, dainty pinks, and the occasional powder blue dominated the scene. Wearing anything bold or vibrant might raise eyebrows and lead to accusations of an overactive imagination. Every outfit was like step one in a delicate dance of deception, where even the most modest of patterns could scream, "Help! I'm a nervous wreck!" Pastel shades spoke of gentility, pacifying an anxious public that needed reassurance that, despite everything, you would never be the loud one at the gathering. No offence meant to the vibrantly clashing urchins from the lower classes. Heaven forbid anybody draw attention to that stratum. Accessories took the sartorial circus to a whole new level. Massive hats crowned your head like an ornate birdcage, with every flower and feather screaming, "I might be a nervous woman, but I'm fabulously buried under this surreal statement piece." Feathered extravagance or extensive lace would balance precariously atop your head, and the absurdity of it all might just drive you a little more anxious, or worse, lead to an unexpected wind incident that would turn the garden party into a scene right out of a slapstick comedy. Then came the shoes, tiny, delicate, and ready to break at the slightest provocation. Picture this. You, balancing on stilt-like heels while trying to navigate the cobblestone streets, every step jarring your nerves a little more. It's like trying to walk a tightrope while juggling a basket of eggs. One wrong move, and you're tumbling down into a pit of societal sidelines. Finding comfort in those fashionable traps was a fool's errand. Imagine sitting in a chair, adjusting your fussy skirt while trying to also avoid a wardrobe malfunction that could send whispers of hysteria through the room. In those moments, your biggest worry becomes whether your outfit would actually hold up against the pressures of society or if it would collapse, much like your nerves, under scrutiny. But heaven forbid you have a wardrobe malfunction. The whispers around the parlour would be as fierce as the winds of change blowing through your flammable fabric ensemble, as the Victorian princesses of confusion pranced through their manicured gardens. They gracefully exited their conversations with charming laughter, only internally thinking, "Please, let me survive another day without unravelling my very existence." The dress code was tightly woven, not just in fabric but in complex emotional labours. Anxiety dictated fashion, influencing choices like a regal advisor whose only advice consistently leaned toward fragility. So when you reflect on those fragile silks and gowns, remember this: they weren't mere clothing. They were tangible manifestations of nervous conditions wrapped up in societal expectations. While outwardly, a woman may have appeared to float effortlessly across the room, her attire belied a myriad of worries, fears, and the very real pressure that beauty and decorum demanded. One classic treatment method consisted of sitting in specially designed chairs called therapeutic chairs. These contraptions were designed to position women in a way that encouraged their nerves to relax, flourishing into an absurd spectacle of some sort of dystopian spa day gone wrong. Expect to hear creaking noises beneath you as you try to make sense of it all. How does balancing on the world's most uncomfortable seat while someone observes you fix your anxiety? If only the therapeutic breakthroughs of the time included a good couch and hot tea, not a rickety contraption that could double as medieval torture equipment. As you reluctantly settle into one of these chairs, remember that comfort was not the priority. No, some mad scientist, the esteemed doctor you'd prefer not to meet, decided that being twisted and contorted like a pretzel was the ideal way to melt away those pesky nerves. You'd wriggle about feeling like a sad marionette whose strings had been hopelessly tangled. And the worst part, you'd get to hear the calculated giggles of the attendant across the room, commenting on how upright your posture appeared, while you silently plotted your escape. The chair had various bizarre shapes, some resembling upside-down bird cages, while others looked like a medieval version of a massage chair, minus any vibrations that might actually help. Imagine the horror of trying to relax while you maintained a pose that only a sorcerer trying to summon a spirit would embrace. Trust me, you found yourself becoming the butt of many jokes, especially among your peers who managed to escape this chair of horrors. "I can't believe I went voluntarily," you might quip while you quietly mourn your pride. Now, let's talk about the appointments that surrounded these unholy seats, because therapy in those days was a team sport. The doctor would come to assess how well your nerves were faring while you sat trapped in this wooden vice. Imagine an old man scribbling notes as he peers at you like a member of a circus audience pondering your sanity. "Ah, yes," he would say, "she's definitely looking less anxious. Or is that just the look of surrender?" You could practically hear the gears of clinical detachment grinding behind his spectacles as you contemplated whether pouring an entire canister of opium down his throat would lead to a breakthrough in your therapy. Even better, the bustling comments from fellow patients added to the experience. Expect to hear giggles and whispers. "Is it too late to ask to be unbound?" Or, "Why do I feel like a lobster in a pot?" Yes, there you are, tucked into a mechanical contraption, While your future potential of relaxation seems as far-fetched as owning a pet elephant, but it wasn't just the chairs and the doctors. The therapy methods extended far beyond. Many women were persuaded to try the unimaginative practice of chair therapy, which for some unfathomable reason involved public viewings. Apparently someone thought that a little exhibitionism would help soothe the frazzled nerves of women. Only strut through what felt like a human zoo, where you essentially displayed what the medical community deemed your embarrassing mental state. The only solace was that if you were going to suffer, at least you were all in it together. They would make eye contact, and in that brief moment solidarity blossomed, because shared misery has a unique way of building bonds. As if that wasn't enough to keep one overly aware of their state, the optional closed-eye sessions began. Yes, someone thought it wise to blindfold you while reclining in a chair. Relaxing, right? Because what better way to inspire tranquility than to entirely sever the sense of sight? But perhaps it was simply a means of providing you with a solid reminder that, to the medical experts of the day, your anxiety was as valid as that of a fainting goat. Next stop, home for wayward wives. Oh, and let's not forget the backdrop. The establishments hosting these horrifying therapy sessions were always decorated in the most shockingly Victorian fashion, the sort that could only be described by someone who secretly loved to drown kittens in pastel colours. Dim chandeliers flickering above you like the burning embers of your sanity, drapes that seemed to whisper judgment as they hung across the perpetually damp windows. If only these charades would provide an ounce of peace. Between the creaking chairs and the flickering lights, it soon felt like you were stuck in a theatrical performance of Waiting for Godot. But instead of existential musings, you merely awaited some relief from your never-ending struggle. Eventually, if you survived the chair, you would likely not escape the inevitable commentary on your character. Odds are your naval endeavours wouldn't be left without scrutiny. Brace yourself for the less than flattering diagnosis that would follow. Therapy had only ever been a mockery, a pitiful cycle of absurdity that left you feeling just as anxious as ever, feeling like you just tried to comfort a cat in a burning sack. So as they usher you out the door, you can't help but laugh while thinking, next time, I'll just take my chances with the leeches. Ever heard of rocking chairs as a route to recovery? Just sway away your troubles became the mantra for many women. Picture yourself softly rocking in a chair, trying to feel zen while your mind still races at full speed. Talk about a mixed signal. Do you focus on the rhythm or spiral further into your thoughts? It's like a mental tug-of-war that makes you question if you should sort out your deep emotional baggage or just stay put and pretend the solution lies in an endless swaying motion. Now, imagine a parlour filled with women who are told to relax while simultaneously being bound by layers of anxiety-inducing expectations. They were expected to create a serene atmosphere, all while their minds were running at warp speed, like a hamster on an espresso-fueled treadmill. As they rocked back and forth, they weren't just fighting against their nerves. They were battling the societal norms that demanded they be perfect wives, doting mothers, and the statuesque pillars of home decor. Who knew a little piece of furniture could hold so much metaphoric weight? These chairs weren't just furniture, they were vessels of hope or despair, depending on how you looked at it. It is said that the gentle rocking motion helped calm the mind and provided a grounding experience. But what if the only thing you felt as you rocked was the crippling weight of societal pressure? What if instead of finding tranquility, you discovered that rocking felt suspiciously like running in place, too far from your thoughts to catch them but close enough to suffocate under the sheer volume of them? In a world devoid of effective emotional outlets, rocking chairs were presented as a simple yet profound solution to complex problems, like using a band-aid to fix a gaping hole in a sinking ship. And let's discuss how these chairs often found themselves positioned at the heart of parlours, like a throne for the anxious royalty. Guests might enter, find you swaying nervously, and immediately assume you were contemplating the meaning of life or luxuriating in nature, when in reality, you were probably trying to resist the urge to scream about the fact that you hadn't set foot outside in weeks. It's almost like the rocking chair served as a buffer against the judgmental world, simultaneously comforting and isolating you from the chatter of frantic sanity outside your cosy nook. Fortunately, not all women succumb to this travesty of mental health care. Some wisely observed that while they were indeed rocking, there came a point where mere swaying wouldn't cut it. You had to be proactive. A few adventurous souls decided to experiment with other means of treatment, like getting fresh air or playful escapades with friends, instead of indulging in endless rocking marathons. Imagine a gathering of ladies swapping rocking for raucous laughter, or unabashedly singing accompanied by a rousing game of charades. It was practically revolutionary, if you ask me. But alas, this was all happening at a time when rocking chairs reigned supreme as the default relaxation tool. You could practically hear the slats creaking in agreement every time someone expressed discontent with their happenings. Such an awful form of coping, yet perfectly acceptable. It became a part of a joke shared by many. If you felt like you could use a timeout, just grab your rocking chair and make yourself available for some good old-fashioned inactivity. And do not even think about leaning into those outer emotions. After all, they might disturb your perfectly calibrated sway. Still, the humorous irony lies in the fact that every moment spent preparing for a metaphoric hug with that chair served as a reminder. Could just sitting still really anchor us in our frustrations? Or were we simply disguising our pain with these whims of antiquated treatment? As many women transitioned from rocking chairs to new age therapies, like actual conversation and productive mental health measures, the rocking chair slowly turned from a shrine of anxiety relief into a mere suburban relic. So, here's to our ancestors who rocked away their thoughts while striving for sanity. From feeble attempts to countless journeys of self-discovery, they faced craziness and societal expectations with a gentle motion that belied the chaos within. And as they transitioned from those wooden seats to a more empowered life, they left behind their creaking chairs to modern women. After all, we are now the lucky heirs of a legacy with the rocking chairs that rock those nerves right away. Well, some of the time at least. So next time you see one, give it a little push. You're not just saying hello to the past, you're declaring your freedom from it. Why not throw a couple of pets into the mix? While a house cat seems cute, many women were paired with animals expected to help cluster around them, creating calming energies. Talk about a bizarre attempt at healing. Imagine needing to pet the neighbour's ferret for treatment because your nerves were too much for a normal encounter. This idiosyncratic practice often led to some very strange treatment groups. Picture a room filled with women and a gaggle of animals, all murmuring anxiously while vying for attention. Your emotional support goose-honking away in a corner, while your weeping neighbour tries to drown her sorrows in a herd of fluffy bunnies hopping about. It's like a petting zoo, but with an air of exasperation, where instead of cutting-edge medicine, the prescription was a whole lot of fluff. But the real kicker was that the expectations around this bizarre practice were just off the charts. The doctors thought these calming energies would be delivered through adorable little creatures that were at best indifferent and at worst having a bad day themselves. These pets weren't exactly the therapeutic companions one would hope for. Imagine trying to find solace in a yappy chihuahua when all you really wanted was a reassuring shoulder to lean on. Instead, you get a tiny creature barking its head off, and you can't stop thinking about your next appointment for a bloodletting. That's effectively trading simple anxiety for full-blown chaos. Now, let's consider a few notable animals that were deemed therapy material. Cats were incredibly popular, and you can understand why. So soft, so fluffy. But what's worse than a purring cat when you're feeling frazzled? It's when it decides your lap is the perfect place for a hairball tribute. Then we have the dogs. Known as man's best friend, they were believed to have an innate ability to comfort those in distress. Their daily agenda seemed straightforward: bark, wag tails, and chew shoes. Only if they knew they were therapy dogs, perhaps their barks could at least be milder than the angry shrieks of annoyance from nervous women experiencing the charm of shared anxiety in a room full of fluff. Of course, as if all this animal therapy wasn't quirky enough, you had significantly less mainstream choices too, like, let's say, ferrets. Yes, ferrets. The perfect companions if you wanted to add a wild card to your emotional support lineup. Imagine lounging on an armchair while your ferret flimsy bolts across the living room in a frantic chase of imaginary foes. Just when you thought your personal misery was being soothed, you have this little creature creating absolute chaos. For anyone concerned with their mental well-being, it was basically the 19th century equivalent of trying to perform yoga with a toddler strapped to your leg. And let's not forget the odd but frequently adopted pairing of women with more exotic pets, like birds, rabbits, or even cobbled together menageries of animals intersecting with their thoughts. There you are, trying to navigate your anxiety over a husband's judgment, while a parrot squawks, "hello," every 5 minutes in a discordant tune. Yes, finding peace in your life sure got a lot harder when your stress-relieving budgie believes it's auditioning for a talent competition. Good luck having a quiet moment with that feathered diva around. Just when you thought things couldn't get any weirder. Know that these cure-all companionships were, of course, entirely misunderstood. If you were to tell a doctor about your continuous inability to find comfort, they'd simply nod and recommend adopting another ferret, as if your emotional management was all neatly swept under the rug of "bring me joy." The reality was that bringing in more animals didn't usually solve the bigger underlying issues: claustrophobic societal pressures, crumbling self-identity, or the gnawing fear of becoming a ward of the asylum. So, the next time you consider therapy options in today's world, remember those outrageous animal sessions that our ancestors experienced. Who would have thought that bonding with your pet could sometimes lead to more misunderstandings than solutions? As comical as it seems, at least it was a colourful diversion in a world where women's issues were often glazed over, or used as reasons to dismiss them outright. So, here's to our furry, feathered or scaly companions, even if we sometimes need a bit more than just a wagging tail or a purring cat to heal those ever-nervous souls. And hey, if nothing else, those critters made great stories, hopefully leaving you with a bit more humour to smile about. If you thought paternalistic language was a recent issue, brace yourself for the 1800s. Many women were often analysed, dissected and minimised by men who thought they understood their societal stresses. Trust that your expert male doctor has figured everything out while you're simply made to feel like a confusing puzzle piece. It was a time when men were declaring themselves the authorities on women's mental health, often with the same confidence you'd expect from someone who had just binge-watched a medical drama. The irony? Most of them had never taken a course on anything remotely resembling empathy. So, how did this expert explanation come to be? Well, sit back and imagine your classic Victorian-era physician, a man in a frock coat, monocle firmly in place, and a fanny pack filled with questionable remedies. They had a cure for everything, whether you were nervous because of silken corsets tightening your ribs or existential dread stemming from never being allowed to express an opinion. It didn't matter. They diagnosed you with hysteria quicker than you could say, "Let me have my own feelings," giving you that vague sense of malaise you could never quite put your finger on. "Ah, yes," they'd say, "you seem to be having a case of the vapours." Allow me to prescribe a nice long rest on a couch in a dark room. Maybe we should throw in a couple of foot baths for good measure. And let's not even get started on how they believed certain physical sensations were indicative of their so-called expertise. Ever felt a little dizzy after trying to balance your daily chores? Well, your doctor might declare it a sign of excessive emotional distress, which was essentially code for, "I really don't know what's wrong with you, but I have a hefty theory." It was like going to the mechanic for a flat tyre only for him to tell you your car needs a complete overhaul just because he felt like diagnosing something. The reality was these men were largely untrained in the complexities of women's anatomy and psychology, but somehow managed to wield power through sheer bravado. They played the role of both doctor and social commentator, insisting that emotional distress could be remedied by returning to traditional gender roles. Yes, nothing says, "Here's how to feel better," quite like a firm reminder of your place in society. "Just calm down, dear. Play with some lace or learn to crochet," they would suggest, as if somehow knitting could unravel all of life's worries. Public hysteria, that mystical affliction only women seem to contract, became a focal point for these paternalistic figures. Most alarming was the belief that a woman who spoke passionately about her emotions or societal injustices was surely suffering from a dangerous case of hysteria. Forget about advocating for your rights. Hop on over to the physician's office for a solid dose of condescension. Instead of simply accepting a woman's lived experience, it was much more amusing to label her worries as nervous afflictions. This not only shifted the conversation away from the issues at hand, but cemented the notion that women needed to be controlled, emotionally, physically, and socially. Imagine being told your distress arose from too much education, or simply too many ladylike pursuits. You'd find yourself stuck in an endless loop of pathetic platitudes, making you wish you lived in an era where women could roll their eyes without consequences. Eventually, many women began to notice this dismissive nature and started fighting back. The seed of feminism was sprouting when ladies began to define their own ailments, reclaiming the narrative of their bodies and emotions. They recognized their own distress came from social constraints, wage gaps, and lack of opportunities, not some esoteric condition marked by fainting fits and sudden tears. So, while those so-called experts were still trying to apply their patchwork quilt of knowledge to women's minds, women were carving out their power and voice. What once was labelled hysteria turned into conversations about suffrage and rights, proving that, while society may have insisted on labelling them as nervous, they were fierce, determined, and incredibly unsedated. It's amusing, really. Men might have held the reins of authority back then, but women were the ones truly navigating the stormy seas of societal expectations. And today, as we reflect on those misguided, often absurd explanations of female nerves, let's gently chuckle as we realise how far we've come while slipping into a comfy bed where no doctor is waiting with a dubious diagnosis. Who said treatment had to be enjoyable? Many women endured methods that were less therapeutic and more torture. Cue the strapping into bizarre contraptions, forced routines, or anything that involved more stress than therapy. It's like signing up for a spa day only to find they'd booked you for an Iron Maiden instead. Picture it. You're ushered into a brightly lit room, greeted by the imposing sight of antique medical devices that look less like healing tools and more like a medieval dungeon decor. This is where the real party begins. First up, let's talk about the enthralling experience of confinement in a resting apparatus, a contraption designed to ensure that you stay still, calm, and utterly miserable. Think of it as a glorified straitjacket constructed from the finest peachy-coloured calico. Exquisite material, but not exactly cosy. You wouldn't want anyone's nerves to get too settled, right? Strapped in and surrounded by pillows adorned with lace, you realise that what they deemed rest was more stressful than trying to balance on a seesaw with an elephant. But let's not forget good old-fashioned water treatments. Those darling hydrotherapy experiences involved wrapping you in wet sheets like a burrito while you mentally debated if your life choices were indeed leading to this watery grave. If you thought the idea of lying soaked and semi-naked behind a closet in a Victorian mansion was absurd, you were right. You shivered, not from the cold, but from the sheer embarrassment of having someone wave a cloth-covered wooden stick in front of your face while declaring, "This will restore your spirit." One could only imagine how much spirit clinging to soggy cotton would actually help one's nerves. And then, the pièce de résistance, electrical therapy. Just the sound of the machine cranking up would likely send anyone's heart racing faster than a jackrabbit. You'd sit rigidly in a wooden chair that looked like it belonged more to a medieval torturer than any reputable physician. As anxiety filled the room like uninvited relatives at a family gathering, electrodes began to zap your skin. Was this treatment or just an elaborate and psychotic game of pin the tail on the nervous woman? You were supposed to feel revitalized, a fresh blossom amidst the withering weeds of life. But instead you flinched like someone had just set off a small firecracker beneath your seat. The medical community certainly had a way with words. They dubbed these experiences as restorative, hoping to assuage feelings of anxiety, but instead leaving women feeling like a jigsaw puzzle missing its corner pieces. By the end of a grueling session, women emerged not renewed, but rather thoroughly confused, thinking, was it the electricity that made me twitch like a marionette, or was that just my anxiety screaming for help? And who could forget the brilliant minds behind herbal remedies? Have you ever heard of tinctures with ingredients so ghastly they could charm a pet rock into submission? Brewed concoctions that included everything from hemlock to valerian root were designed to ease the nerves. Some women were fortunate enough to sample medicinal wine composed of fermented roots mixed with unnameable herbs from the nearby hedge. They swirled their cups, peering anxiously at their reflections, a motley crew of questionable sanity. Was this the spell to make their nerves calm, or a recipe to invite hallucinations? The verdict was still out. And let's not forget the dreaded sensory deprivation techniques. These might include sitting in a dark room where you contemplated your life under the guise of self-reflection, while all the while the spirits of anxiety gathered like pesky flies buzzing around your head. Forget about being nurtured. It felt more like being stuffed into a tightly wrapped package meant for delivery to an unknown destination. Probably one with a return to sender label attached. By the end of the day, the weird concoctions, manipulative machines, and elaborate strategies meant to soothe existed only to keep women in a consistent state of altered reality. And while women tried to extract some form of enlightenment from this absurd treatment landscape, what it boiled down to was that much of their suffering had little to do with their mental state, and a whole lot to do with how inexplicably absurd medical science had become. So, what became of those brave souls who survived these cures? They emerged, much like a butterfly from a cocoon, if that caterpillar had spent months in healing chambers filled with pedantic doctors who somehow thought that mockery was a valid form of therapy. With memories of pouring their energies into nonsense remedies and believing a dab of leech saliva somehow cleaned up the mess of their emotions, they learned to turn their experiences into sharp wit. And isn't that the best medicine of all? Travel for a rest could also serve as a treatment method. Imagine being sent away in a carriage to a spa retreat where you could spend time away from your stressors. Except, did they mention, you were probably forced to share that carriage with a dozen other nervous women. Enjoy the shared, hollowed-out silence where everyone fidgets with their dysfunctional traits in a confined space. Picture it. a rickety carriage creaking down a bumpy road while you nervously contemplate your life choices and attempt to ignore the woman next to you, who's spiralling into a whirlpool of anxiety over the number of roses she forgot to water before leaving. And don't even get started on the charming carriage wagon smells. It's like a delightful bouquet of lavender mixed with the faint scent of anxiety sweat, and, oh yes, the lingering essence of questionable cheeses packed for the journey. As you bounce along, you listen to the deep philosophical debates about nerves that inevitably arise. Did you hear about poor Margaret? They said her spirits were too high. Real philosophical stuff right there, just shy of Shakespearean tragedy. Spoiler alert, everyone's spirits are too high if they put you that close to a dozen other twitchy souls. Once you finally arrive at your intended destination, a spa that is less about serenity and more about soft-spoken judges handing down despair incarnate, you find that the accommodations are, well, creative at best. Expect to be greeted by a nurse with an enthusiasm that suggests she's far too chipper for the general malaise of existence. Welcome. We're going to soft-soothe your nerves by having you bathe in ice-cold water and then lie in this bed where you can ponder every mistake you've ever made. Ah, the benefits abound. Now let's talk about the daily routine. Each morning you wake up in a bed that feels like it was stitched together from an old barn, and you quickly learn that your neighbours share more than just a lax attitude toward personal space. They also share bodily sounds, routines, and an unspoken game of who can annoy each other the most. It's like summer camp for women with mental health issues, but without the fun songs and s'mores. Instead, picture a group of you sipping herbal tea that tastes like disappointment and discussing. What else? Your nerves. Then comes the treatment planned for you. A group exercise called Gentle Talks. It's an eyebrow-raising circle of women, sitting on their chairs attempting to mingle, while discussing the mental breakdown tour they've had through their lives, with all the charm and subtlety of a Victorian novel. I remember when my neighbour said I couldn't take the children to the fair because I screamed at the cat, one woman confesses, blushing red as a ripe tomato, while others nod in empathetic understanding. Guilt and anxiety are like best friends, aren't they, you might think, rolling your eyes internally while desperately trying to retain some observational dignity. Then there's mealtime at the retreat, comprising dishes that can only be described as cardboard coated in old hopes. You sit down to an exquisite bowl of gruel that's somehow both bland and suspiciously textured, served alongside chunks of bread so stale they could double as weaponry in a medieval battle. You chew thoughtfully and wonder, the big question, is this gruel really doing my nerves any good? Meanwhile, your fellow residents are trying to outdo one another in sharing their complaints about dishes that barely pass as food. Oh! How are we supposed to recover if our nourishment comes with a promise of existential dread? Afterward, there's an invigorating outing planned, a nature stroll where you might reconnect with the earth, or our greatest fears. Remember when you thought exploring the woods was a fantasy dream filled with sunshine and chirping birds? Think again. Here, it's all about the discomfort of attempting to keep up with your fellow nervous women, while tripping over roots and coordinating tears. Feel free to take part in a delightful muffled sob while listening to the melodious sounds of nature and the unmistakable crunch of leaf-laden ground beneath your feet. Who knew a forest could serve as the perfect backdrop for mutual breakdowns? At the end of the day, as twilight settles over the asylum, you and your companions gather again in the common room, sipping on teas brewed from plants that may or may not have been recently harvested off the floor, as you reflect on the day. You might even start to feel a sense of camaraderie with these women, bonding over your shared experience of ludicrous confinement. So here's the takeaway. Nowhere is the absurdity of 19th century medical treatment for nervous women more evident than in the ridiculous concept of transporting them to some supposed spa resort. As it turns out, the only thing harder than escaping your nerves is escaping an entire carriage of women with their own shared human complexities. Doesn't that make modern therapy seem like a treat? Just one more reminder that while history might make you cringe, it also leaves us rolling in laughter. Who says it's all about the patients? Men played every role from doctors to husbands, usually dictating the course of a woman's treatment. Imagine having to listen to your husband explain your treatment options, while you can barely nod along with your nerves simmering under the surface. A delightfully twisted power dynamic that left many feeling utterly powerless. This system could make even the boldest woman feel like a cheeky side character in someone else's drama, unable to take centre stage in her own mental health narrative. For starters, the male-dominated medical establishment often treated women as if they were some delicate porcelain figurine, fragile, beautiful, and utterly incapable of understanding their own minds and bodies. Picture this: a woman walking into a doctor's office filled with anatomical diagrams that look like they were stolen from a child's colouring book. Here stands her husband, proud as a peacock, presenting her case, while she fidgets nervously, feeling more like a specimen in a jar than an actual human being. It's as if she'd been placed in a reality show where everyone is obsessed with her symptoms, yet she's not allowed to weigh in on the rules of the game. These men held an extravagant array of biases and misunderstandings toward women, often attributing their emotional or psychological struggles to nothing more than supposed feminine weaknesses. Somehow the idea appeared that women were more prone to emotions because of hysteria, a word that literally originates from the Greek word for uterus. Imagine being treated based not on your actual experiences but on outdated stereotypes from ancient mindfulness. This wasn't just a medical offence. It was akin to being sent to the corner of an imaginary room where the rules didn't apply to half the population. If you think your modern therapy sessions involve overzealous input from your partner, you'd be flabbergasted by the husband-influencing counsellor model rife in the 1800s. Husbands often did a very commendable impression of unsure medical specialists while providing unwanted advice. "Darling, the doctor said a nice round of full bed rest will do you wonders." Meanwhile, you're left wondering if full bed rest means having someone clear your schedule for the next 3 months. What if you wanted to, talk about your feelings or actually pursue a career? That could be a problem because the social structure was designed to keep women tucked away, fragile and genteel, like fine china in a cabinet that's opened once a month. As if this circus of confusion didn't already sound exhausting, we had what was known as the patronising physic thrown into the mix. That's right. Men were convinced that treating women's ailments involved a blatant lack of empathy and a smidge of moralising. The male doctor declares, "What you need, my dear, is virtue. A healthy mind comes from a pure heart." What he presumably meant was more baking pies and less walking around cities looking for empowerment. It's like he's prescribing you a recipe instead of a treatment plan. The compliance expectations didn't stop there. Women often were made to believe they should submit entirely to their husband's authority over their health. "Well, my husband thinks I should try waving a feather over my head 3 times a day to dispel my nervous energy," is not something anyone should be forced to endorse. Yet therein lay an indication of how women's autonomy was snuffed out. Forget about becoming empowered. You were just as likely to be given a feather duster instead of real solutions. Worse still, many doctors didn't just wave away their patients' concerns. They scrambled to soothe their clients' nerves with comforting words that seemed more rehearsed than heartfelt. Such expressions boiled down to glorified patronisation. "Oh, dear lady, you are simply exhausted by the strains of your tiny brain. Let's send you back home to rest, shall we? This was one of those doctor knows best sentiments parading around like a peacock, smothering women's voices and desires like a weighted blanket that's just a touch too heavy. Nonetheless, in this chaotic symphony of condescension, there existed an unyielding tide of resilience. Some women, armed with nothing but sheer determination and good old-fashioned nerve, began to question this patronage. Slowly they crept toward discussions about empowering their own health narratives, seeking treatment on their terms, and wouldn't that require a lot more than a feather in a husband who thinks he knows best? The narrative moved gradually toward reclaiming agency over one's body and thoughts. A shift needed, and women certainly proved that resilience wasn't taking a back seat, because if history has shown us anything, it's that stubbornness will never follow convention. So as we reflect upon the 1800s and their absurdities, let's remember that women, even shaped by these utterly twisted power dynamics, forged ways forward through mountains of societal expectations. Who knows? Perhaps one day those men will be reminding their great-great-granddaughters of just how resilient and strong the women in their family have become, navigating through the nonsensical chaos of it all, often while facing men who couldn't possibly understand, just like us with our own struggles today. So many cures, so little time. Women were bombarded with various remedies from herbal teas to bizarre tonics, promising to fix their nerves. The result? A constant cacophony of concoctions that left nervous women feeling more dazed than before, as if settling on just one solution was an exercise in futility. It wasn't just a matter of finding your favourite flavour of tea. You'd have to endure being a human test subject for an arsenal of dubious potions that could make less sense than a raccoon at a formal dinner. Doctors of the day had a buffet of options to choose from, each offering their own unique spin on miracle cures, usually accompanied by a side of dubious ethics. First up were the herbal teas, which sound delightful until you discover they were concocted from anything but delightful ingredients. Want to calm those nerves? How about a nice cup of "this will probably kill you" brew, made from dried goat's feet, chamomile, and a sprinkle of sassafras? Yes, because what could alleviate anxiety better than sipping on a potion that sounds like it was meant for a witch's cauldron, rather than a calming evening ritual? Oh, and if the flavour doesn't make you question your life choices, the aftermath certainly will. Imagine grappling with both a nausea that could rival the worst hangover and the realization that your soothing herbal remedy has thrown your digestive system into complete chaos. Next, we had the tonics. They were advertised as the ultimate solution, liquid hope in a bottle. But peek a little closer, and you'd see that they were often spiked with opiates, alcohol, or even worse, a hefty dose of despair. These elixirs were peddled as miracle workers, but were more likely to make you feel like you'd just been hit by a stagecoach after 3 whiskey shots. Oh, you wanted to feel relaxed? Well, congratulations. You're about to experience bliss coated in the long-term struggles of addiction, a charming ensemble of side effects, including slurred speech, confusion, and an overwhelming urge to nap in public places. However, the arsenal didn't end there. Enter the therapeutic waters stage of treatments. Yes, ladies, pack your bags. It's time to take a holiday. Promised serenity awaited at magical springs, where mineral-rich waters claim to cure all of your woes, including a serious side of skepticism. Your doctor would assure you that immersing yourself in vat-like mineral pools, dripping with healing properties, would wash away your nervous tendencies. Did you feel better after a dip in these murky waters? Not a chance. You either left feeling like a humid sponge or with a generous case of otter's ear. Still, you'd return home swearing you were better than ever. Spoilers, you're not. Then there were the rubs, creams, and potions, each more fantastical than the last. These magical emulsions would come with extolations of their unique powers, a guaranteed path to nirvana or your money back. Want to calm that heightened anxiety with a little over-the-counter cream that smelled like grandma's attic? Sure. But it seemed that good old anxiety rub was 50% essential oils and 50% hope. You'd be slathering the stuff on, convinced it would work, while secretly thinking, if I stink of lavender, at least that's one thing to help mask my mounting dread. Let's not forget the magical tinctures created in the basements of curious chemists and energetic herbalists, intended to cure ailments ranging from anxiety to existential crises. Imagine some devoted male apothecary enthusiast accidentally mixing his renderings with mystical incantations. The result was that half the time you'd end up with an elixir that either tasted like syrupy despair or sent you on an unintended psychedelic journey during your Thursday afternoon book club. Is that a new author, you might ponder, as the walls begin to breathe and your neighbour's cat becomes the new literary critic. All of this created a true buffet of insanity, where women were left jousting with their own nerves while battling peddlers of ridiculous remedies. There was something intoxicating about all this chaos, a collective sense of humorous absurdity in a society that couldn't quite determine whether anxiety was a psychological emergency or just another fashionable crisis for women to navigate. The cacophony of cures never truly faded. It simply morphed into a more modern version of do they really work, though? Oh yes, ladies, from herbal teas to miracle tinctures, welcome to the funhouse mirror of 19th century medicine, where nothing was off limits and nearly everything was dubious. So, as you tuck into your comfy chair tonight pondering the hilarious yet bizarre reality of these solutions, rest easy knowing that at least you're not part of that chaotic mix. Instead, you can breathe easy with clean air, no mystery tonics, and that calming herbal tea made with actual ingredients that won't send you spiralling into sheer confusion. Just remember, history may be absurd, but it's also proof that people are endlessly inventive, sometimes to a downright ridiculous degree. It wasn't only diagnosis that was slippery. Often, treatments were mischaracterized as doing wonders for the feminine mind. Imagine having someone slap a light and breezy label on torture. Treatment chatter became full of contradictions designed to soothe anxiety while only heightening confusion. It's like trying to find clarity in a storm without an umbrella. Not surprisingly, these baffling approaches added layers of ridiculousness to the already tangled mess that was women's healthcare. As the 1800s rolled on, the phenomenon of creative mislabeling took on a life of its own. One minute you'd find a physician earnestly advocating for ice baths as the ultimate remedy for nerves, and the next he'd be suggesting a daily dose of whale oil mixed with syrup as the key to tranquility. Excuse me? Whale oil? Maybe the doctors were just trying to make this sound exotic so that women felt special, and not simply subjected to bizarre fads that might have them slipping into an emotional abyss. It's precious, really, how they thought slathering on blubber was an effective balm for just about anything. Imagine the scene. You, a nervous woman, being told to soak in ice-cold water for working through your anxiety. The fingers of frost would wrap around your bones as you tiptoed toward the tub, contemplating whether freezing to death might be more appealing than enduring yet another treatment designed to help. All the while, your doctor stands right there, beaming like a proud parent. You're going to love this, he declares, while you're doing everything you can not to scream in disbelief. This is known to invigorate the spirit. Ugh, invigorate. More like intimidate. You could barely feel your toes. And let's not forget the dietary regimens targeted toward those perception-challenging, nervous women. Medical advice would often include grime-tinged recipes featuring unconventional ingredients like nettle soup and asparagus juice, as if blending vegetables could somehow mix a soothing potion to combat mental instability. It's like the doctors were playing a culinary version of roulette with these ingredients. Well, if nettles don't work, let's try something that sounds unappealing, shall we? If nothing else, these whims would have you wondering if your nerves were a result of being asked to consume horrid concoctions designed to make even the strongest stomach churn, rather than purely due to societal pressures. Curiously, it was often where science met superstition that these labels flourished. There were occasions when white coats and musty old books declared the benefits of being in the family way for perpetually nervous women, because nothing calms a restless mind like the promise of future motherhood, right? Now your anxiety becomes a societal problem to fix, while your pain gets dressed up in the playful attire of womanly duty. You find yourself reluctantly considering if maybe a lifestyle change could do wonders. Spoiler, it didn't. Time and time again, societal norms painted women as inquisitors of emotional chaos, when all they were striving for was a little clarity in an increasingly confusing environment. Medication? Out of the question. Instead, your doctor would prescribe extreme measures. Perhaps a doctor would throw around terms like a gentle touch of leech therapy, as if it were just a bonus perk. Hey, you might even lose a few pounds. After all, what are a couple of leeches when mental health is at stake, right? It's very much like saying, no pain, no gain, but with a goopy side of questionable hygiene. Women would walk into these medical establishments hoping for solutions, only to be met with an amalgamation of solutions more confounding than a riddle at a carnival. A curious blend of compassion and ignorance defined the atmosphere of the times. Doctors laboured under the pretension that they were saviours, while accidentally imprinting even more anxiety onto those seeking help. Often, these musings were an elaborate cocktail of well-meaning confusion, spiced with cluelessness about the delicate workings of the human mind, especially when it belonged to a woman. Ultimately, the term nervous woman became synonymous with a hodgepodge of whimsical treatments and misguided compassion. And yet, through all the mislabelling and bizarre concoctions, women still marched on. They navigated this stormy sea of so-called cures with grace and an unyielding spirit. After all, if life and therapy were going to dish out absurdity, you better believe they were going to make the most of it. If you thought treatment was biased, be aware that men and women were treated quite differently. Male hysteria was hardly a thing, while women were hyperanalyzed. A man's nervous disorder was often seen as a charming quirk. For women, it was grounds for making them a treatment project. Talk about double standards. Picture a world where a man's anxiety led to a sympathetic pat on the back and a suggestion to take a long vacation, while a woman was whisked off for a lecture on improving her temperament. It's as if society slathered men with honey while women got spoon-fed bitter herbs. Consider the length that women went to in an attempt to understand what it meant to be nervous. You could collect a range of diagnoses like badges of honour. Ah, I see you're suffering from female nerves. Have you tried being more demure, perhaps? It's enough to make you roll your eyes harder than a Victorian debutante faced with the idea of wearing last season's dress. Men enjoy the luxury of being considered complex creatures grappling with profound thought. In contrast, women were pigeonholed into categories that rendered them practically edible. Delicate catered snacks for the nervous condition buffet. This distinction led to a veritable buffet of treatment options tailored specifically to calm women down, often shooting for gentle and landing somewhere near imprisoned. For instance, can you imagine being told that if you were just a little more compliant you could escape non-existent mental instability? Doctors often resorted to physically confining women to rest cures, which did more for a woman's anxiety than a dentist's chair does for a fear of drills. Absolutely nothing. And let's not forget about the delightful wooden contraptions designed for therapeutic purposes. ever heard of a therapeutic chair? A chair specifically engineered to hold you upright while you ponder your own inadequacies. Surely nothing screams self-reflection like being strapped into a torture device that could only have been invented by a particularly mischievous carpenter. Not to mention the role of friends and family. Ah, yes, the supportive champion team that one never knew was necessary. Women's mental struggles were often dismissed as female nonsense by loving husbands and fathers who desperately wanted to keep their workplaces free of hysterics. Friends often became unwitting accomplices, asking far too many loaded questions about your emotional state, while clinking teacups as if that would magically make your fears go away. In the realm of male treatment, the scenarios were dramatically different. A quick diagnosis by a well-meaning physician could lead a man to a simple regime that involved strong drinks, awkwardly masculine bonding sessions, or hitting the bar with a never talk about feelings policy fiercely adhered to. Why discuss your nerves over a cup of chamomile when you could instead over a pint? It's like living in a world where half of the population commercialised their emotions into an unwritten rulebook, while the other half was left to navigate a labyrinth of psychobabble. And amidst all this, do take a moment to consider that dopamine-fueled roller coaster known as opium, which floated around the male quarters like free samples at a candy store. Men dealing with anxiety usually found themselves satisfied with a little tincture on the side, conveniently sidestepped from the reality that a nervous disposition could very well lead them to total dependency. Meanwhile, women found themselves shuffled off into wards where their supposed hysteria could be monitored like a compliance experiment gone wrong. Of course, as with all other things rooted in the past, a woman's fear or anxiety could be exacerbated by the very conditions society imposed on her. What could be more nerve-wracking than to realise everyone around you believed you were inherently fragile? Entering that twisting patriarchy dance floor was like stepping into a minefield, hoping you wouldn't accidentally step on a really nasty stereotype that could blow up your chance at a decent reputation. This omnipresent scrutiny of women's mental health didn't just affect individual treatment, it shaped cultural perceptions. That's the crux of it. As a result, women's mental health was often tied up in notions of virtue and deservingness, like their destiny came packaged with a pretty bow that said, if you're anxious, you just aren't trying hard enough at being the ideal woman. In a world full of these extreme practices and cultural misconceptions, it's hard not to feel a surge of admiration for all the women who navigated through this turbulent sea of diagnoses, judgments, and decidedly unhelpful treatments. To think that they managed to flourish, despite the weight of society's expectations, was nothing short of remarkable. So here's to them, to their resilience and humour, in a world determined to make their nerves synonymous with their femininity. You can almost hear the collective sigh of relief from those historical, nervous women, finally forging their way into a future where they can express their anxiety without it resulting in diagnosis worthy of a sitcom episode. As the century relented, treatment was slowly evolving, like a caterpillar transforming into a butterfly, but with a bit more hesitation. The transition from dubious methods to something resembling actual therapy was glacial. Women began to chart their own course. Thank goodness. They stepped into an evolving world that began to take them seriously. Sort of. It was the dawn of modernity, and while some methods still seemed ripped from the pages of a horror novel, the medical community was beginning to put down the leeches and pick up the actual science textbooks, though they still had a suspicious fondness for opiates. Picture the scene, a room filled with women, all nervously shifting in their chairs, half of them convinced they'll soon be whisked away to another round of rest cures, while the other half are simply questioning whether their medical professional genuinely believes that a hunk of bread and a good old-fashioned prayer will solve anything. Spoiler, it won't. But finally, some reformers were saying, Maybe this nervousness isn't derived from some mysterious lady-specific malady, but more from societal pressures and lack of genuine support. Imagine a doctor who actually listens. What novel ideas! Yet, despite the glimmers of progress, many treatments were still more aligned with the gothic horror genre than with actual healing. Enter the asylum reforms of the mid-1800s, which aimed to transform grim, prison-like facilities into places of care. Newly enlightened doctors began focusing on creating an environment that emphasized comfort, sunshine, and, wait for it, actual therapeutic practices. It's like going from an overcooked stew to a Michelin-star dinner, where women were no longer seen merely as nervous beings, but as individuals requiring holistic care. They might even talk about feelings, without causing an uproar. But let's back up for a moment. As the world outside began to change, inside the treatment rooms, there was a clinking sound that mirrored progress. Not chains and shackles, but the sounds of new medical instruments and therapies. Why give you a leech when I can prescribe you a bath with Epsom salts? Became a fashionable sentiment. This era saw a rise in hydrotherapy, which encouraged women to soak in bathtubs amid splashes of blissful warm water, having gentle attendants remind them how lovely it is to relax. Of course, after a month of daily soakings, many participants were left wondering if these baths solved their issues, or merely distracted them long enough to contemplate life again, smells included. As movements fought for women's rights surged, so did healthy outlets for expression. Women began forming support groups, creating safe havens where they could voice their struggles without the grim stare of a judgmental doctor. They traded notes on what helped soothe their nerves, from herbal remedies to shared laughter about the absurdities of their treatment histories. Humour became medicinal. Imagine a circle of women sitting cross-legged, laughing heartily about their overcooked rest cures, while sipping herbal tea mixed with barely contained sarcasm. You think that will make us feel better? Hand me another biscuit and a bit of gossip instead. But while these revolutions simmered, prominent male figures within the medical community tended to remain, dare I say, a bit clueless. Many clutching their monocles and waving off emerging feminist ideologies as if they were just passing fads. The condescending attitude persisted. It was as if some members of the medical establishment took offence at the thought of anyone challenging their authority. Doctors engaging in full-on intellectual gymnastics to justify their unease about women disobeying their prescriptions, whether those be pills or the latest trends in corsetry. And so, the evolution came with its share of growing pains. The rescue morphed into various forms of therapy. Counselling and talk therapy began creeping into homes and society at large. And genuine conversations, once a rarity in chilly treatment rooms, became a frequent occurrence, not just for women dealing with nervousness, but for entire families seeking to understand one another's fears and frustrations. Now you weren't just a nervous woman, you were a member of a movement, a partner in the quest for a better understanding of emotional well-being. You could argue that a good diagnosis was merely a step. True empowerment came from collaboration and connection, the kind you couldn't achieve lying alone in bed grumbling about how nobody understands. At the end of the day, while we chuckle at the past's bizarre medical choices, let's take a moment to honour the persistence and resilience of those women who navigated these confusing waters. They fought for validity in a world that often dismissed their experiences, and in doing so, created pathways for the future. Yes, progress took its time, much like a tortoise in a race against a hare consuming weekly rest cures. But they emerged from their chrysalis stronger, ready to take on the world and make sure that no more women suffered silently, fumbling in a system that so often got it wrong. No leeches necessary, only empowerment and community. Despite the turmoil of this bizarre little chapter in history, we must acknowledge the resilience of women who weathered it all, with a dash of laughter. What an accomplishment! From leeches to lobotomies, our ancestors navigated the strange waters of their treatment options like champions. Whether they were bedridden and bored, or roaming through narrowing paths of understanding, they kept their spirits alive and various, contributing to our very understanding of women's issues today. Imagine being tethered to a life of Victorian decorum, suppressing your emotions while the world outside raged on like an express train heading toward chaos. Nervous women found themselves at the mercy of doctors who often turned more to harmful prescriptions than to actually listening. Treatment at times felt less like a path towards recovery, and more like a theatrical performance filled with exaggerated gestures and dubious remedies. The comedic aspect of it all was that the sufferers themselves often had to become their best allies, rallying one another in a movement for better care with nothing but humour and collective eye rolls. Picture this. A group of women gathered in a sitting room, huddled in corners, sharing tales of their latest treatments, over cups of tea that would make a modern herbalist cringe. "Oh, you were prescribed leeches again? How quaint. I was just soaked in cold water and told to sing to the moon." They'd chuckle amongst themselves, knowing those charades of treatment were less about real healing and more a way of life they found ways to navigate with humour. The absurdity of it allowed these women to reclaim their power in an era where they were often seen as delicate flowers, prone to wilting under life's pressure. Even in the face of electric shocks and tedious bed rest, women found ways to cope. The rest cure sounds like something out of a hilariously misguided spa brochure. Enjoy a quaint stay at the sanatorium of permanent boredom, where no intellectual stimuli are allowed, and the only physical activity you can engage in is the steady rocking of your chair. The irony, of course, was that many of these so-called cures turned women away from the very freedom they sought, yet somehow they managed to laugh through it. They eagerly exchanged notes, so to speak, treating their experiences as humorous anecdotes rather than the chains of oppression they were. Of course, these stories didn't stay within those cosy rooms. They crept out into society, shared at dinner tables and whispered during tea with just enough cheekiness to make the men shift uncomfortably in their chairs. Such conversations became the backbone of a burgeoning movement, planting the seeds for future generations. The laughter, in essence, was a quiet revolution, a gentle push against the confines of societal norms that dictated how women could express their emotions and, by extension, their pains. It turns out that humour was a lifeboat in a sea of absurdity. Women began to understand that laughter could offer a glimmer of hope in the darkest of times, a way to dissociate from the treatments that beamed down on them like oppressive sunbeams at high noon. It allowed the nervous woman to step out of the shadows and into her voice, even if it was through a joke about her latest bizarre treatment. "Did you hear?" one might gleefully chirp. "I was shocked back to sanity. Literally." The more they shared their stories, the more collective empowerment surged through those they dared to laugh, and thus the recognition of their shared experiences became a form of solidarity that no doctor's prescription could replicate. As we reflect on this legacy of laughter from the 1800s, we must recognise how it has laid the groundwork for how women's mental health is addressed today. Women are no longer just victims of circumstance waiting for someone to save them. They're now warriors, champions of their own narratives, armed with their wit and the wisdom of past generations to fight stigma and demand the understanding they always deserved. So, in a world flooded with unhelpful prescriptions and the dire atmosphere of suffocating societal pressures, what better weapon could they wield than humour? Because sometimes, laughter isn't just the best medicine. It's the only medicine that makes the struggle bearable and the journey worthwhile. Ladies, may we always channel our ancestors' spirit of laughter as we navigate the sometimes absurd world of health, past, present, and future.